Hello, I've been asked to do a video about John Redmond, who was leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. He was born in the 1850s in Waterford, Ireland. I can't remember Wexford. He later represented Waterford. I can't remember his year of birth, 1856, I'm going to guess. He went to Clongowes School, which was a very prestigious school run by the Jesuits, where James Joyce later went. And then, unusually for a Catholic, he went to Trinity College Dublin, because by the 20th century, Catholics were forbidden by our own church from going there. Trinity, which he set up by the Church of Ireland, welcomed us, but you had to get a dispensation from your bishop to be allowed to go. And that wasn't granted till 1970, on the basis that we'd be infected with Protestantism if we went there. Anyway, he left without a degree, though he was later called to the bar in Ireland and later England and Wales. So he went into politics. He's elected a member of Parliament, I think, first of all for New Ross, and later shifted his seat to Waterford. So he came from a well-off family. They've been major landowners in his home county for centuries. Some of his ancestors have been rebels in the 79 Rebellion. He had some collateral ancestors who have been executed by the Crown forces for that. So he's proud of his rebel past. But I think, if I've got it right, one of his uncles helped to repress the 1867 Fenian Rising, particularly some of the fighting around Cork. So he entered Parliament, and he was a very loyal supporter of Charles Stewart Parnell. And when the Catherine O'Shea divorce case broke, Redmond stayed with Parnell when 2/3 of the party were against him, either a Parnellite or an anti-Parnellite. So Redmond believed in free trade. He shouted that from the rooftops. Another significant thing is the Second South African War, 1899 to 1902. He thought that the British Empire was wrong in that, and that the Transvaal Republic and the Orange Free State, despite having launched unprovoked attacks on the rest of South Africa, that they were in the right, and the British Army should not fight back after this invasion. So he denounced actions such as detaining Afrikaner civilians in internment camps. Afrikaners were Dutch-speaking whites, despite the word Afrikaner might be a bit confusing. They were not black people, so-called Afrikaners. He seemed to be an insurrectionist, and some of the things he said would have been seen as seditious, like going to the United States and saying there's not an Irishman in America who wouldn't be happy to see the German army marching from Great Yarmouth to Milford Haven. I mean, Yarmouth, the very east of England. Milford Haven's in Wales. He actually said across England, but forgetting that Milford Haven is not in England. So was he just suiting his messages, saying something to suit his audience? That's why he's giving such a message. But maybe it's significant sent an Irishman in America as opposed to people who are actually in Ireland. So seemed to welcome the defeat of Great Britain. That was a few years before the First World War. But then the First World War broke out. I remember the Irish Volunteers had been set up in November 1913, and not by him, but then the sort of governing body of the Irish Volunteers, and he insisted that some nominees of the Irish Parliamentary Party be on it, and he got a few of them in there, but the Irish Volunteers was not actually his baby. He spoke at a Home Rule rally in front of the General Post Office in Dublin in 1913, and who shared that podium with it but Porrig Henry Pearce. So P.H. Pearce speaking up for Home Rule. Some people say, was he a constitutionalist because he spoke alongside Redmond? But no, he wasn't. Later on, he wasn't anyway. So the First World War broke out, and he showed himself to be a British patriot, and he urged people to join up. Said the Irish Volunteers would go wherever the firing line extended. That was in a speech at Woodbridge, County Wicklow. So a significant shift in policy. Remember, the Irish Volunteers were set up to defend the liberties of the people of Ireland. Partly Home Rule they were hoping to get. I remember they were in response to the Ulster Volunteers, who were established in January 1913, not 1912, actually, as all the murals say. So that was a fateful decision, throwing in his lot with the government's war effort, the government of the United Kingdom, since we're in the UK at the time. And so, as Ramsay MacDonald said, no war is at first unpopular, but the war dragged on, the casualties mounted, there appeared to be no end in sight, and there was real suffering as a result. So support for the war dipped and dipped and dipped in Ireland as it did in Great Britain, probably a bit lower in Ireland than it had been in Great Britain in the first place. Then some Irish Republicans thought this was a heaven-sent chance to turn their guns on fellow Irishmen, on fellow Britons, to split us away from our kith and kin in Great Britain. Anyway, so he urged people to join up, and some of his relatives did. His brother, Willie Redmond, was killed in action. Tom Kettle, formerly a Home Rule MP for, I think it's East Tyrone, was killed in action. And there's a memorial to him on Stephen's Green in Dublin. And he's saying, he said, isn't it a pity he'll be remembered as a British officer rather than an Irish nationalist? So then the Easter Rebellion came and obviously took him by surprise, John Redmond, and he said that the government had to act with firmness. They'd been right to do so. He said that after the first 3 people had been executed, Pearce, whom we'd known, Tom Clark, and I can't remember who the third one was. But then he said it was too much to stop. And bizarrely, he said he was proud of the rebels, despite them obviously having been in league with the Second Reich. That's Germany, in their proclamation of the Irish Republic, saying they were supported by gallant allies in Europe. Blatantly, that was Germany, despite Pearce lying to his men and claiming that German troops had already landed in Hibernia, which he knew to be a fallacy. The Germans were not sending any troops at all. They'd already told him that even before he found out the arms were coming. They said, no, we're not going to send a single soldier. Anyway, so public opinion beginning to shift, and more sympathy build up for the rebels after they got killed. The men who died, they're called. Yeah, hundreds of people died in Easter week. Why did only these 15 who got shot matter? Anyway, it was a sort of nauseating how illogical most people are. So another thing I've brought up at Redmond is he married twice. And yes, he was a Catholic, but his mother had been a Protestant. I think she converted to Catholicism on marriage. He certainly was brought up as a Catholic. And he had kind of distant English ancestry, as his name shows, even on his father's side. So he married a Protestant English woman first of all. And his son is William Archer Redmond, if I got that right. And then his first wife died, and he went to Australia. He married a wealthy Tasmanian woman, but I think she was born there to Irish parents and had more children with her. So he's very conscious of the British Empire and really wanted to be part of it, and argued that this was Ireland's empire as much as Great Britain's, so he didn't want to lose everything. And even when he was talking about the second Home Rule Bill in 1893, he said he still wanted Irish representation in the Parliament of the United Kingdom. We'd still be part of the UK. It'd be sort of like devolution within Scotland now, because he thought the empire was a magnificent achievement. Remember, this is the apogee of imperialism. So, yes, the United Kingdom was the imperial hegemon, and imperialism seemed just the normal and natural at the time. Irishmen served the empire, everything from being Governor General down, say Governors General of Canada, Viceroy of India, like the Earl of Mayo, John Burke, to give him his name. Lord Mayo College is named after him. There was a governor of Hong Kong who was Irish as well, and some of them were Catholics, like that governor of Hong Kong. And there were Irish missionaries and administrators, and the Irish priests who were spreading Christianity, usually Catholicism, in these countries to the benighted heathen, as they would see it. They're protected by the British Army. They've often been killed before they were there. So what are the trade advantages of that? So it doesn't suit 21st century Irish nationalism to remember that mainstream Irish nationalism was imperialist, and so this is comparable to some other European countries, not to African, Asian, or South American countries. So the generational moment had come and gone. Home Rule had not been achieved, despite the Home Rule Party being the largest party in Ireland since 1874. So we've been waiting for 34 years and it still hadn't come. Nationalism had been radicalised in Ireland, as it had throughout Europe, by the war. Militarism, the sight of guns and the use of guns had become normal, as Pearce said. So people were desensitised to violence. And so his party was older, grandmotherly, toothless, bland. And so people were more attracted by this more exciting and bolder party, Sinn Féin, and their different vision of completely breaking away from Great Britain and setting up a republic. So remember, revolution was in the air. That was the two Russian revolutions in 1917. By late 1918, attempted revolutions in Germany and elsewhere. So he was very ill, and indeed he died in 1918, the height of his anti-conscription campaign, because things were going badly for the Allies in 1918. Russia pulled out of the war. In March 1918, the Germans were able to transfer over 1 million troops to the Western Front, and this is before Americans started to arrive in Europe in significant numbers. So the United Kingdom was very worried about this, was short of men. conscription had begun in January 1916, but excluded Ireland only for Great Britain. So the UK government thought we just might have to conscript Irishmen, and really all shades of nationalist opinion were against. The Irish Labour Party was against, obviously the Home Rule Party, the Catholic Church, I mean not an explicitly nationalist organisation, was against. Sinn Féin was obviously against. So people said death before conscription. So he started speaking at anti-conscription rallies, and this Military Service Act was passed, extending conscription to Ireland, but never implemented. They thought any man caught drilling, as in for the Irish Volunteers, would be called up. The Irish Volunteers started to call themselves the Irish Republican Army, as in the IRA. So it was never implemented. Partly it would have taken more soldiers to enforce than it would when it was raised as part of the idea. Remember, Irishmen continued volunteering for the British Army right to the end of the First World War and indeed beyond. I mean, to this day, some men from the Republic of Ireland are joining up. But obviously, the number of volunteers coming forward was going down and down through the war because they'd seen the death toll. And one of the few positive effects of the war is unemployment virtually disappeared. It's very easy to find a civilian job in Great Britain, if not in Ireland at the time, because people were needed in all sorts of war industries or to replace men who'd gone off to the front. So Redmond died broken-hearted in 1918. So his party seemed to be less popular. It did claw back some support in 1918, though. John Dillon took over as leader. So he was the son of John Blake Dillon, a rebel of 1848. So the Redmond family were popular in Wexford, and his son won the Wexford constituency in the December 1918 election, that 14th of December, and the Redmonds were remembered fondly for decades. Not Wexford, sorry, Waterford. Remembered fondly for decades in Waterford. These two W counties beside each other. Well, there's a third. There's Wicklow, 3 W counties in a row. Anyway, so his son had campaigned for Parliament wearing his British Army uniform, Irish Guards uniform, that red, well, that scarlet tunic and big black Busby hat made of bearskin. So his son later set up a party in the late 1920s called the National Democrats. Didn't last very long. Most of them joined Fine Gael. So Garret Fitzgerald was an outspoken admirer of John Redmond, and John Bruton later had a portrait of John Redmond up in his office saying, constitutional nationalism was best, and avoiding violence. I mean, not that Bruton was a pacifist, thought it was right to fight sometimes, that John Redmond was much overlooked. If the First World War hadn't intervened, he would have delivered Home Rule. That would have been better. Remember, September 1914, Home Rule was passed by Parliament, and Redmond indeed is celebrated by singing God Save the King with his colleagues there in the UK Parliament. He'd flown the Union flag over his house for the duration of the First World War, partly showing this war, a war to unite us all, as they called it. And he said at the beginning of the war that Unionists and Nationalists, Protestants, Catholics, would see that one bond united us all against a common foe. But it didn't in the end. Well, that unity was sort of shattered by the IRA's rising at Easter 1916, setting people at each other's throats when they begin to shoot the Royal Ulster Constabulary and so on. A stab in the back, as the Unionists perceived it, just at the moment of maximum danger, therefore had to meet maximum punishment. And actually, the government was very, very mild. Of the rebels who had captured hundreds of them, every single one of them could have been executed for treason, for rebellion, and so on. But only 15 were. Roger Casement later hanged for treason, as in adhering to the sovereign's enemies in time of war, and the others just imprisoned for a few months in Frongoch and then set at liberty. Extraordinary, unexampled compassion, but such generosity of spirit was not met with any humanity or any gratitude on behalf of the IRA, who went back to violence. So just shows how humane and glorious the United Kingdom was. Well, that's John Redmond, a sort of tragic figure whose dream didn't come true. Okay, Ireland left the United Kingdom. We were a dominion, as it was, as the 1921 treaty explicitly said. We had the same status as Canada. Obviously turned into a republic in 1949, which he'd explicitly disowned, and there was a partition of Ireland, something he was eager to avoid. He'd said he'd prefer to see his head partitioned from his body than to see Ireland divided. In 1914, he'd reluctantly accepted a 6-year delay in the implementation of Home Rule to the 6 counties, but temporary measures have a habit of becoming permanent. Here we are, 106 years later, and partition's still there. Anyway, that's just a little bit about him. He's buried in Wexford Town, I believe. I would like to visit his last resting place. So it's a pity that his generation didn't succeed. And you can read, who was it, Conor Cruise O'Brien, about constitutional nationalists who felt they were going to inherit this new home rule state, but that never happened, and it went to a different sort of hothead. That's enough from me, so please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Callahan spelled Callaghan. It's all small letters. Toodaloo.